to the words you have to say to us, God. Because, God, we do believe that you can move mountains, and that you have the power to change any obstacle we face, God. And we just thank you for this time together. Amen.
For 33 weeks, we have talked about the Sermon on the Mount. And I wonder if at any time during these 33 weeks you've imagined what it might have been like to be with Jesus on that day. To listen as the new rabbi began to teach like no one else. He revealed truth. His teaching had radical implications. He spoke as no one who had ever spoken before him, and as if he was speaking to your very soul, penetrating the soul. He was the embodiment of the holy Word of God, and therefore his words were not only spoken words, they were living and active, sharper than any double-edged sword, and the teaching of Christ penetrated even dividing soul and spirit, joints and marrow. Christ's words judged the thoughts and the attitudes of the heart. As he taught on that hill against the backdrop of the Sea of Galilee, a huge crowd had gathered. It seemed as if every community in that day had its outsiders, and the communities around the Sea of Galilee were no different. Have you ever felt like an outsider? Have you ever felt like somebody who didn't quite fit, somebody who was judged by others or looked down upon by a group of people? Perhaps this outsider was close enough to hear Jesus' words as he taught. Perhaps not. The rabbi who kept the crowds riveted for hours was finally through. The message was done. The crowd, which had now been dismissed, discussed excitedly the words and the true meaning and the radical implications of Jesus' manifesto on the kingdom of heaven. And no doubt, as many discussed, most ignored, and some looked down upon the disfigured and the diseased outsider, considered unorthodox, considered by all Orthodox Jews to be unclean. The outsider was looked down upon. He was considered by many to be the scourge of the community, worth nothing. He would have been considered the victim of his own sin. It was his own fault that this terrible disease had come upon him as far as society was concerned. It was his sin caused by the heavy hand of Jehovah God that had struck him hard. It was his sin that made him a nothing. Nobody was to blame but him. At least that's how the society viewed it. Today's message is going to be a little bit different. For today, we're going to peel back about 2,000 years of history, and we're going to encounter what it might have been like to meet Jesus that day, just outside the gates of the city. I'm going to tell the story in a first-person dramatic form from the perspective of a man with leprosy. And I'm going to take some dramatic license today. I want you to know that. But my hope is that you will understand the story of Jesus and see him with fresh eyes by taking a look at Jesus from the viewpoint of a leper. So listen to Matthew 8, verses 1 through 3. When he came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus reached out his hand and immediately touched the man. And he said, "I am willing, be clean." And immediately the man was cured of leprosy. I'll never forget the day. It was almost 3 decades ago. My wife Miriam and I, we had a great life. Beautiful children, a nice home. I was a fisherman plying my trade on the Sea of Galilee, and I loved my job. Almost every person in our town was impacted by the fishing industry. Sure, there were shepherds and farmers, and there were soldiers, and there were carpenters, but everyone loved the bounty that came out of the sea. Everyone loved the lake. That's what the Sea of Galilee really is. It's a lake, not much different than your Minnesota lakes. When you're in a town around the Sea of Galilee and you look around you, you see some hills that are beautiful, reaching nearly 1,400 feet above sea level. And then there's that beautiful view from towns like Capernaum, Tiberias, and Bethsaida, and Gennesaret, this vacationer's delight, where you see what you know as today as the Golan Heights, mountains that rise 2,500 feet above sea level. It was indeed a beautiful place to call home. Miriam and I, we carved out quite a good life. Our children had good friends. Our family had good friends. We loved to entertain in our home. We'd invite families over. We'd talk about Jehovah. We'd play games. We'd laugh. We'd share meals. We'd share life. And we'd talk about the stories on the lake. Our synagogue taught us how to live. We were far from the political upheaval of Jerusalem. It seemed a simpler place to live. I loved it here. We had it good. And then it happened. And everything changed. It was early in the morning. I was preparing for my normal day of fishing on the lake. My two oldest kids were already at the synagogue school. My youngest was still home. I hugged my kids goodbye. I was shaving. And there was this nagging thought that was going through my brain as I shaved that morning. It was a thought that I had tried to put away. As I shaved, my blade cut my face. I didn't even feel it. My blade had cut my hands, and I couldn't feel it. The numbness of my hands and feet had been there for so long, and I had tried to put away the fear from my mind because everyone who grew up in that part of the world feared leprosy. Everyone feared the disease that started with numbness and it became worse. The fear of leprosy is ingrained in us from a young age. You see, leprosy was thought to be highly contagious. In our Jewish culture, it was also thought to be a punishment that came from God because of our sins, and rightfully so. For 3 times in our scriptures, Jehovah had used leprosy as a punishment for the disobedient. It happened to Miriam, my wife's namesake, the sister of Moses. She had disobeyed, and in Numbers 12, 6 through 10, Miriam was struck with leprosy. My Miriam would always find it ironic that I was struck with the same disease as the woman named Miriam. Uzziah faced the punishment. The king of Judah had been a good king for a while, became proud, and touched some articles of the temple that he wasn't supposed to touch, and God punished him with leprosy, and the king was forced to live away from the people. And then Gehazi was afflicted with the judgment in 2 Kings chapter 5. So don't be so quick to judge us as being dumb and simple-minded and stupid because we thought that leprosy was a punishment for sin. It would be almost 2,000 years after my affliction that Dr. Hansen would discover the true cause of leprosy. My disease was caused by the disappearance of the warning system that enables human beings to understand pain. Your doctors have found that Hansen's disease, as it is now caused, brings numbness to the extremities as well as to the ears and to the eyes and to the nose. And the devastation that follows, that comes from such incidences as reaching one's hand into a charcoal fire to pick up a potato and not realizing you're being burned. Or the devastation that comes when you wash your face with water just trying to get ready for the day and you have no idea how hot the water is and you burn yourself. Or you're working in your fields with a hoe and you work and you work and you work and you work so hard that you cause your hands to eventually become stumps. Don't look down on us. You don't know what it's like. I cut myself so bad shaving, but without the aid of a mirror, I didn't even notice. Didn't notice the stream of blood that was running down my face. I failed to notice the blood where my hands had been cut. I'll never forget her eyes. My wife looked at me and her eyes had pity. They had fear. My wife's eyes never had fear. She was sad. She was nervous. I could see her mind racing. What would she do? What would I do? What would become of our family? Worse, what would become of our home? A fisherman's life isn't easy. I wasn't a rich man. I had a little bit saved away, but I wasn't prepared for this. Miriam looked at me with sorrow. She was sorry for me, sorry for herself, sorry for our kids. Her unspoken words said what my heart knew was right, even though it seemed so wrong. I would have to leave. There would be no final embrace with the woman I loved so much. The hug that I gave my children as they left for temple school would be the last one they would receive from their dad. There was little I could do to contribute to the needs of our family. I would become an outcast, living amongst the outcast, begging for my daily needs. I would become a beggar with a painful and an agonizing death sentence. And my wife, for all practical purposes, would become an outcast too. And that hurt me worse than my own life. For 30 years, I have lived on the outskirts of this town. Levitical law required that the clothes I wore would be torn. And my hair, I couldn't keep it nice. It had to be unkempt. And every time somebody passed me by, I, with my covered face, would yell, "Unclean! Unclean!" I grew to hate those words. Unclean! 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 I must have muttered them a million times in 30 years dying. The law required that I remain alone, outside of my community, as long as I had the disease. It wasn't uncommon for lepers to live in close proximity to each other. We developed these colonies of lepers, and our bodies, well, we just rocked together. We didn't want to see our own reflections because what we saw in the other lepers was sickening. And when we did see our reflections, the person who stared back at us in the pool of water or on the mirror when we saw the occasional mirror was but a dim reflection of the person that we used to be. And all we saw were painful reminders of the life that we used to have. Jewish law required that we would remain at least 184 feet away from someone if we were upwind from them, and 7.36 feet away from somebody if we were downwind from them. Josephus, that great Jewish historian, said of our lot that we were, in effect, dead men. Dead men. Oh, I can't tell you how many days I wished that that was true. If only I was a dead man, was my thought on a daily basis. For living as the unclean in my ultra-religious Israeli homeland was a fate worse than death. For 30 years, I had lived as an outcast. There had been occasional glances that I was given of my family, and I treasured those times, but they were also piteous times. I remember one time when I saw my son playing with other children in the village. I was able to get a glance at him through the gate that separated me from those who were clean. I was glad that he was somewhat included. I was glad that even though his family had been through so much, that he could still smile and laugh and giggle with the other boys. But as my son came near me, I had to yell those words. Unclean! Unclean! My heart broke as I watched my son try his best to speak up on my defense. There were words exchanged, there were punches thrown, there was a son who was shamed by the boys. The boys looked at my son and they said, "It was your own father's sin that caused this to come upon him and your family." I wanted to scream, "I'm no more a sinner than your father. I'm no more a sinner than the rest of the men in this village, in this region." Why were the children so cruel? Why were the looks so painful? Why would God allow this to happen to me? Why had He even allowed such a hideous disease to exist? There were many nights where I doubted the goodness of Jehovah. Many nights where I wondered, God, why me? I missed my daughter's wedding. I missed my grandson's birth. I missed the moments I used to take for granted. I missed the conversations at the end of the day. I missed pulling up the fish at sea. I missed making a living. It's hard when your job's taken away from you. There's a pride that a man has in his work. And there's no pride in begging. I missed the celebrations. I missed our national celebrations, those 4 festivals that we celebrate as Jews, where the towns around the Sea of Galilee would become alive with life, throngs of visitors. I missed the inclusion. A leper's life is lonely, it's humiliating, it's painful, and it's full of sorrow. I missed the nights with my family and friends. I missed the touch of my wife. I missed her tender kisses. I missed the compassionate touch. It had been 30 years without an embrace. 30 years without someone's touch. 30 years without a kiss. And in those 30 years, my body had been ravaged. The disease had taken its toll. Where there were fingers and toes, there were now stumps. My hands and my feet were unrecognizable. And my face looked like something out of a horror story. Children were afraid of me. They'd hide their eyes. Mothers would cover their kids' eyes as they passed me. I used to be the man in the neighborhood that the kids would come to. I was the teddy bear. And now I was the person in their nightmares. I prayed and I prayed and I prayed that God would be merciful and just take my life. Then my wife would be free to marry again. She would be taken care of. I loved God. I tried my best to live a life that pleased Him. I tried to be an honorable man. And I wondered what the sin that I committed was that was so great that it would cause this terrible event to happen to my family. I was so alone, and I was in such pain. There were nights I even considered ending my life. It would have been easier, but my faith taught me that that wasn't a viable option. God knew what I was going through. Jehovah had allowed it. And I believe that even though His judgment was upon me, He loved me, even when I didn't feel like it. My begging took care of my most basic needs. My family somehow got by. And I was grateful for at least that. Just as I will never forget the day that I was afflicted with leprosy, I'll never forget the day that I met Jesus. He had been spending so much time in the villages around the Sea of Galilee. The young rabbi was growing in influence. Many men from the surrounding villages had joined him as disciples. Men like James and John and Peter and Andrew, fishermen like me. I had seen Jesus before. He'd walked past me on a few occasions. And as he did, I yelled, "Unclean, unclean." There was something special about Jesus. You know how there's some people that you meet in your life that you just want to get to know? There's something about them, the way they handle themselves, the way they treat others. There was this kindness in Jesus, a gentle way in which He treated others. There are some people that just seem to bring out the best in everyone around them, and that was Jesus. He could bring out the best, and then with some people, He could bring out the worst. But with me and with others like me, there was compassion in His eyes, even when He passed me by. One day, Jesus gathered a huge crowd around Him, and they sat for hours. They even stayed through lunch. And when all was said and done, the crowds were amazed at His teaching. As the people descended the mountain where Jesus taught, I listened to their words. I wondered what it was they were going to say about Jesus. And between my shouting, "Unclean, unclean," and begging for money, I listened to what the people said. Some people said, "No one has ever taught like Jesus." Some people said, "He taught as one with authority, not like the teachers and the chief priests and the scribes." Some said he's a heretic. He's doing away with our law. He teaches a different message than the Sanhedrin teach in Jerusalem. Men and women talked excitedly about that which Jesus said. They talked about those whom Jesus called blessed. There was debate over what He meant by blessed are the poor in spirit. There was debate over Jesus' expanded definition of adultery. There was debate over what Jesus meant about the wide path and the narrow path. I had never heard such talk after a rabbi had finished teaching. The air was electric. Everybody was talking about the sermon that they had just heard. I wished I'd been able to watch it in person. I wished I wasn't unclean. I wished that I could have heard the rabbi's words. I knew Jesus was special. There was something about him and about the way that people were talking about him that made me wonder. I wondered if he might be that long-promised Messiah. I continued to shout, "Unclean! Unclean!" as the crowds made their way past me. I had never seen so many people moving in this part of the city. Keep in mind, I lived in the outskirts of town. People rarely wanted to walk past me. I was outside the city gate, but Jesus had picked a place to teach that required that many would walk right by me. Little did I dream that Jesus would be one of those walking by me on that early evening. Apparently, when Jesus dismissed the crowds, they lingered. Some left ahead of him, most followed him. They wanted to hear more. They wanted Jesus to keep talking. He had been preaching for somewhere between 9 and 12 hours, but they didn't want him to stop. They were asking him questions, and he was answering their questions. They were talking and laughing. They wanted Jesus to reveal more truth. They wanted to know the practical implications of what it meant to live as citizens of the kingdom of God. And so he continued to teach as he walked. Little did the crowd know that Jesus was about to show them what it meant to live as citizens of the kingdom of God. Little did I know that I would be such an important part of Jesus' object lesson that day. As Jesus and the crowd approached, I didn't know that it was the rabbi coming. And so I just shouted out, "Unclean! Unclean!" And I held up my money tin and I shook it, hoping that maybe I'd get some more. Most of those in the crowd just ignored me. As I asked for funds, some of them just looked upon me with disgust. There were a few that looked upon me with pity that day. But then my eyes caught Jesus' eyes. Those tender, powerful eyes looked down upon me once again. And I don't know what came over me. To this day, I question what made me think that I could do what I did. As a leper, I did the unthinkable. I stood up and I ran toward the crowd, ignoring every law about the distance that I was supposed to keep from them. I stood near a crowd of clean Jews. I stood by those who used to be my neighbor. I stood by the now grown children who used to make fun of my son. I, the unclean, approached the clean. Some of the crowd screamed at me, "Get away! You're unclean! You're making us unclean, you fool!" Some of the mothers shielded their children's eyes and took them away from me as if I was some hideous creature. Jesus just looked at me. The crowd parted quickly, not wanting to get too close to the disfigured sinner with the highly contagious disease. All the eyes were upon Jesus and me. I felt more than a bit foolish. I wondered if a soldier might emerge from the crowd and put his spear right through me. It would have been an appropriate punishment as far as society was concerned. But no one moved. It was as if everyone was frozen, watching the unclean and the rabbi. I bowed in front of Jesus, and he looked at me with those eyes as I bowed. Those beautiful, penetrating eyes. And I didn't see judgment in his eyes. I had no fear as I stared in his eyes. There was no condemnation. There was no horror in his eyes as he looked upon me. There wasn't disgust, the look that I got from so many people. When Jesus looked at me, the best description that I can give is that he loved me. I could hardly believe what I heard come out of my mouth. Lord, I'm humbled. If you are willing, you can make me clean. I didn't ask him to heal me. I asked him to make me unclean, to make me clean. Healing was too much to ask for. I'm so tired of yelling unclean, unclean, that my own children and wife had to hear those words come from me, that the crowds had heard them for years. I wanted spiritual healing. I wanted wholeness. I wanted something of my dignity back. I wanted to experience the touch of God, and this Jesus knew God like I didn't. Like I said, I thought that perhaps he was Messiah. But I wasn't sure. But I did believe that he could do something wonderful for me. I had no idea if he'd do something or not, but let me tell you, Jesus did something. For the first time in 30 years, I felt the touch of another human being. Jesus touched me. He grabbed my heart. In the crowd, they gasped. There were some who murmured, "What's he thinking? The rabbi has just become unclean." There were others who thought Jesus just gave himself a death sentence. Jesus didn't care what they thought. His eyes locked upon mine. And he said, "I am willing. Be clean." I could hardly believe my ears. "Be clean," Jesus said. I almost missed it, though, because I was still blown away at his touch. I've got to tell you, I felt wonderful. I'd been touched by the rabbi. But furthermore, he had declared me clean. Now, it's one thing to declare a leper clean. It's an entirely different thing to see a leper healed. And immediately, I was cured of my leprosy. Where there had been stumps, there were now fingers. Holes in my face had become skin. My ears were healed. My toes were no longer gone. My feet no longer looked like logs. My forehead and my eyebrows returned to their natural state. My hideous appearance appeared whole. I was a brand new man. It was the one time in my life I wished I had a mirror, because everybody else got to see what was happening to me. But me. The crowd was in shock. Jesus didn't just talk a good game. He lived it. He lived the Sermon on the Mount. Some of your scholars have written, though the leper was not worse or guiltier than his fellow Jews, nevertheless, he was a parable of sin. I was a parable of sin, an outward and visible sign of an innermost spiritual condition. I was a physical illustration of the heart of every human being. If for one moment your scholars say we could see a visible incarnation of ourselves apart from the cleansing work of Christ, we would see ourselves as the walking dead. Forms dead in their trespasses and sins. Forms trying to cover themselves with filthy rags. My friends, I was a picture of the spiritual condition of every man, woman, boy, or girl to ever live. All of us, apart from Christ, are like I was in my former condition, a leper. Healing begins when we recognize our uncleanness and shout, "Unclean, unclean," to God. Have you done that? Have you said, "God, I need you. God, I'm not worthy of you. God, I am filthy inside, and I need your healing touch. It's like Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. We can't experience that until we recognize the true condition of our hearts. So many in my day and age were content to see me as unclean, but they couldn't see the true condition of their heart. Healing continues when we humble ourselves before God, recognizing that He is our only hope. You see, when Jesus walked down from the mountain that day, I had no hope except for God. And He had taught that spiritual truth to all who were gathered on the mountain that day. And now He showed them what it meant. What it meant for God to be your only hope. And our healing is sealed when we place our faith in Jesus Christ, who was more than a rabbi, more than a great teacher. I would find out was more than a human being. He was God in flesh, the God-man, the one who in His incarnation took the sin of my life upon Him at the cross, who took the ugliness, who took the pain, who took that which keeps me from God and took it upon Himself. Jesus is Messiah. He can take our leprous hearts and make them clean. Christ's greatest work in me wasn't by physical healing.